Now, we do have a very special international guest. You've seen him up here since the start. It's very hard to sum up Dr. T.L. Guidotti, whose conference folders contain amazing lists of his work he's done to raise awareness of occupational health. Dr. Guidotti is an internationally acclaimed epidemiologist who's joined us all the way from Washington, D.C. He's an interesting, is that as well, but an industry icon in the world of occupational and environmental medicine. Specialty credentials in Canada, the US and the UK, recognised by the American Board of Toxicology. Now, he trained in internal medicine, pulmonary medicine and occupational medicine at Johns Hopkins after completing medical school at the University of California at San Diego and an undergraduate degree in biology at the University of Southern California. 30 years in academics as professor, clinical chief, department chair and institute director. His interests include making those tiny ships in the bottles, tapestry from the 17th century, and collecting Coke bottle caps from different eras. Actually, that's rubbish. I just made that up. But unless he does, I don't know. What is not rubbish, though, is, and I can let you in on a little secret, next month he will be awarded the Knudsen Award, which is the highest accolade globally in occupational medicine. He's going to accept that in Florida next month. He's co-authored more than 200 publications. His studies have laid the foundation for law changes to help firefighters in Canada and the US. His research has helped us here too. It was included in the Australian Senate inquiry into the Fair Protection for Firefighters Bill. He is known throughout the world. We're lucky enough to have him here. Please put your hands together for Dr. T. Guidotti.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this. Well, I don't know what to say. I'm thrilled and excited to be here. I would like to thank the organizers of the conference and Peter, Mick, Greg, and the amazingly competent UFUA staff who have made my journeys so pleasurable and efficient. It is an absolute privilege to be here today in what I consider to be the noblest of noble causes. In your notebook, you have an earlier draft of the presentation which has numbers in it. It has too many numbers, and it's too dense. So what I'm going to do in my oral presentation is talk about the science as opposed to presenting the science. You have the numbers if you want to use it for your own purposes, but I'm going to be giving a broader overview of where I see everything fitting. And unusually, we have plenty of time because you have I've commented that this is the first meeting I've attended in a long time that has actually been ahead of schedule. And Waddy, before she left, said, well, they're firefighters. Of course they're on time. So a vivid demonstration of the culture of firefighting, and that's one of the things that makes it so exciting and rewarding to work with you folks. If we could have the first slide. Not exactly sure how to. Okay, there's the first slide. Of course, our reason for being here is cancer. There are many other outcomes of concern with firefighting, and some of them relate indirectly to cancer in ways that are not obvious. So I'll point some of these out as we go along. But today we're focused on cancer, but we shouldn't forget that there are many other issues involved in firefighting that make it such a hazardous occupation. It's the most hazardous of civilian occupations. And it's a voluntary assumption of risk, which is quite extraordinary. The ergonomic demands of firefighting, in other words, the energy expenditure, the muscle energy that's required to move around, the problem of heat retention, which is such an important integral part of working around fire, pushes firefighters to operate essentially at the limits of human physiology. There's really no other civilian occupation that forces people by circumstances to work at the outer limits of what the human body can tolerate. And although this has obvious implications in terms of safety, and particularly in the design of equipment, of safety equipment, which can and has in the past contributed to the ergonomic burden of the firefighter by being overly heavy and bulky and throwing people off balance and so forth, the safety and the ergonomic issues therefore indirectly inform and complicate the occupational health and the hazard related issues because of in the past SCBA was so difficult to deal with. So the fact that there are these safety issues, the fact that you are operating at the limits of physiological tolerance, actually connects to the cancer risk in a very indirect way. But of course, we all recognize that the safety hazards are so severe, and if we weren't talking about cancer, we would be talking about those. The toxic exposures that we've spent so much time on, and that Commander Whitaker has so eloquently and brilliantly described using this very room as an example, are changing. And they're not changing for the better. They changed rather abruptly in the 1960s and 70s with the introduction of synthetic materials. As you know, the fire environment got a lot more dangerous as a result of the introduction of products that combusted and created products that were more intensely carcinogenic even than the natural products that were in common use before. Wood and so forth are much less carcinogenic. They're still carcinogenic, don't get me wrong, but they're less carcinogenic than the combusted plastics. And this is, in fact, this trend is going to continue. Certainly, the introduction of new materials, especially composite materials and plastics, is not going to stop. In fact, one of the major economic trends that we see in North America is the return of the manufacturing industry. Yeah, it's true that economically, North America and Europe are back in terms of manufacturing, and proportionally less, not necessarily less in absolute terms, but proportionally less is being made for us in places like China. But what are being made in the new technology and the new workplaces are based on plastics. They're based on composite materials, and especially this new technology you may have heard of called three-dimensional printing, which is essentially taking like a printer for your computer, but instead of little dots of carbon that go on the paper, it's a little bit of composite plastic that forms in layers and can form remarkably complicated shapes at very low cost. And this is leading a renaissance in manufacturing in Europe and North America, which is based on materials that are not so safe when they're combusted. So this is not a problem that's going to get better anytime soon. In fact, it might get somewhat worse in the near future. The fact is that engineers don't necessarily think of hazard when they produce these materials. They think of performance and not failure. So I think that one of the tasks ahead of us for the future is to prevail upon designers and to prevail upon architects to maybe give a little more thought than they have in the past to the design of structures and materials so that they're not quite as dangerous in a fire situation. Here's some carcinogens on the slide. You've heard of several of them. Don't forget 1,3-butadiene, a recognized carcinogen that's certainly found in fire smoke. It tends to be left off of a lot of lists, but it's very important. Mr. Whitaker, Commander Whitaker mentioned cyanide. I think that the story between carbon monoxide and cyanide is sort of an instructive tale. As you know, for many years, people tended to neglect cyanide as a potential exposure. And the reason they neglected cyanide was, I think, informative. And it's an example of what I call paradigm blindness. It wasn't that they didn't know that there was cyanide there, and it wasn't that they didn't know that there were nitrile plastics, which when combusted produced the cyanide. It was that they didn't think it was important because they were fixated on the relative importance of cyanide to carbon monoxide. And I've just recently, my latest project related to firefighters had to do with writing a book chapter on cyanide. And I think it's fairly clear that people should have been aware of the hazards quite a long time ago, but issues, for example, the development of antidotes and so forth, were delayed because everyone was saying, well, don't get carried away because it's really carbon monoxide. Well, maybe in some cases it's both, and we kind of missed an opportunity there to maybe 10 years where we could have protected people at a higher level. You all know about overhaul, so I'm not going to go into that because this audience knows it better than I do. And of course, the advent of SCBA. But SCBA is an evolving technology. It still has practical limitations and that make it non-ideal in terms of, for example, wearing a tank and going up a staircase in a house on fire. It's where you can't see very clearly. It's not an ideal technology, but it's by far the best we have. We tend to forget, I think, that SCBAs have actually been around for a while, but the old ones, the metal tanks, were not very practical. The big problem, though, was when use was required. And when use was required and when use was adopted are two different things. It took a fairly long time, even when they were nominally mandatory, for SCBA to be adopted. And I think that we tended to say, oh, well, people should have known better. Well, it's hot during overhaul. People have just been engaged in knockdown. It's kind of a natural tendency to take the mask off. The point is that these things need to be designed not for the optimal conditions that the engineer thinks are going on in a fire scene, but what actually happens. And there should be a lot of consultation. And I think that there in the future will be room for improvement in this technology. And I'm delighted to see the vendors here for the turnout gear and personal protection, because I think that the closer interaction, the better in getting these things more optimal. Vehicle-related issues are, interestingly enough, relatively new. Or I should say relatively new in recognition, because firefighters have been saying for a very long time that the diesel exhaust from fire engines was a problem. And a lot of people said, well, how can it be a problem? After all, you've got fire smoke, and the diesel exhaust is a lot safer than gasoline-powered engines. Well, that's true, but that doesn't mean the diesel exhaust is harmless, and it also means that the major problem with gasoline really came from carbon monoxide, which is lower with diesel, but it's not negligible. What people were missing was the particulate matter that comes off of diesel exhaust, the very fine small particles that float in the air and cause the visible smoke. Finally, well, I'm not exaggerating, I first became aware of this issue and was involved in a project very marginally 35 years ago, that involved the question of was diesel particulate, or are diesel particulates carcinogenic? People actually didn't want to believe it. They sort of marginalized the evidence at that time, which basically came from underground mining. Every occupation had to do its own study. There was a lot of variation and so forth. And it took 35 years for the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is the authoritative group in the world, to pull it all together and declare once and for all that diesel particulate emissions are carcinogenic. So it is now clear and well recognized. And of course, there's the whole issue of the maintenance of vehicles and the issue of motor vehicle injuries. Personally, I became aware when one of our technicians wrote on an engine and actually did some sound level measurements, just how loud they are, and what a problem noise-induced hearing loss is. But that's out of scope, maybe a topic for a future initiative or a future study. Firefighters' health concerns have also been often dismissed on the basis of lifestyle and confounding factors. The public view of firefighters is that they don't go out very often, that they basically sit in the fire hall, and there's a lot of attention to the sort of fire hall culture. Well, not today. Firefighters are not spending, in my observation, nearly as much time at the fire hall, partly because of the assumption of other duties. So urban firefighters now are pretty much on the go most of the time. And I think that a lot of these confounding issues that had to do with diet, that had to do with sedentary activity, which is no longer attributed to firefighters, are now gone by the wayside because of participation in fitness programs, mandatory health standards, and so forth. And of course, firefighters used to smoke slightly less than the general population, adjusted for income level and education. And now they probably smoke a lot less, and certainly smoke a lot less than they did in the past. So cigarette smoking is no longer as much of a confounding factor. We'll talk about what confounding means later, but basically a confounding factor is one that obscures the relationship between the health outcome, like cancer, and the exposure. The fitness and healthy worker effect has now, I think, kicked in. So, fitness programs have been around long enough to have a conspicuous effect on the survival and the health of firefighters as a population. We call that a selection effect. The firefighters are chosen to be fit, about the most rigorous fitness standards of any civilian occupation, and then they remain in the fire service. They have to meet standards. And in the past, it used to be fairly common for a firefighter who couldn't keep up to be more or less sheltered. I don't think that's as common any longer, partly because of the way the fire service is organized. The healthy worker effect in the past has not been as visible for firefighters as for other occupations. And that's of great concern, because an occupation for which members are this highly selected should have a much lower mortality than the population in general. And what we saw in the earlier studies, ones that were done before the 90s, for example, tend not to show a strong healthy worker effect. What does that mean? It means that there's a lot of mortality hidden in that population, that in fact the mortality should be much lower. It may be, overall mortality may be close to the general population, but it ought to be much lower. And the difference there, the difference between the two levels, represents a hidden gap of firefighter ill health that's obscured because firefighters ought to be so much healthier than the general population. So that's what I mean when I say that the healthy worker effect for mortality, for deaths, lag. Now, why are we talking about this now? Well, interestingly, a lot of attention to issues involving first responders came out of September 11, 2001, and the horrible events of the World Trade Center especially, and the experience of the New York Fire Department. I think that their experience is so different in so many ways in terms of what they were exposed to and also some of the characteristics of the New York Fire Department, that it's kind of hard to go from the 9/11 experience and to generalize to firefighters in general, and so I would caution against doing that automatically. But I think that kicked off a lot of interest, and one of the first jurisdictions to see this and to see the potential was the province of Manitoba in the easternmost prairie province in Canada, lovely place full of thousands of lakes and very rugged countryside. And in 2002, following this, they took the initiative, and Canadian provinces, one by one, adopted presumption as their standards. The biggest battle was probably fought in British Columbia. It took a long time and a lot of effort on the part of the British Columbia firefighters, but they finally broke through the resistance because at the time British Columbia was quite conservative about these issues, and won the presumption. 35 American states have presumptions for selected cancers, and there's currently a bill that is almost certain to pass in the Parliament of Quebec, which is called the Assemblée nationale. Well, I'd like to point out, though, that we have actually been here before. There was actually a wave of presumption that happened in the middle of the last century that resulted in a lot of legislation for firefighters and also police that had to do with cardiovascular disease and presumption for heart attacks. And we tend to forget that wave of presumption preceded the interest in cancer. And some social historians should take a look at it and what the rationale was and the pressure that was brought to bear in order to get presumptions for cardiovascular disease written into law. The fascinating thing is that a lot of people kind of poo-pooed it because, again, the literature didn't show a strong cardiovascular effect by traditional measures. And those traditional measures included mortality, overall mortality for the entire population at all times. So a lot of people have actually said, well, this is an example of presumption that was carried too far. Well, we now, after however many years, 40, 50 years in some American states, that in fact they were right. Because we have a wave of superb studies, some of the best in occupational medicine, coming out of a group at Harvard, led by a colleague of mine by the name of Stefanos Kalis, that published in journals of the reputability of the New England Journal, which is the top journal in North American medicine, that show beyond a doubt that there is an excess cardiovascular risk. The problem is that it comes and goes. It's associated with response to an alarm, and it happens only at certain points during a firefighter's day. And if you look at overall firefighting experience, you don't necessarily see it because you have to do a time series and look at when these events are occurring, and you find clusters. Well, what that means is that the first wave of presumption was, which was considered at the time to be ahead of itself and maybe not as firmly grounded, in fact was exactly right. And I think that is important for us in terms of building confidence in what we're doing. Now, how did I get involved in this? Well, I started out in this particular area by doing a large study in the province of Alberta, which is 2 provinces over from Manitoba, Saskatchewan being in the middle. At the time, it was quite large. It's since been superseded by other studies, which is what science ought to do. It ought to continually improve. And we put in a few innovations that were sort of unique for the firefighting literature at that time, although other studies since then have tried to do something similar in different ways. And one of them was that we adjusted for the opportunity to be exposed by taking into account the work assignments for each firefighter. This was an additional level of complication, but to us it was very important because we began to see things, particularly for kidney cancer, that weren't so obvious when we just looked at all the population as a whole. We were also able to look at 2 cities at the same time. The city of Edmonton and the city of Calgary, in addition to being ferocious rivals, are actually quite different in terms of culture and somewhat different in demographics and so forth, and they represented a nice natural comparison. The city of Edmonton was absolutely essential, instrumental not only in anchoring the one half of the study and very collegially allowed us to gain access to the records of their firefighters. But they also played a huge role, a critical role in interpreting the results and in pushing forward the application of the work that we did that later led on to the wave of production that went across Canada. We were very pleased that subsequent studies showed that we weren't too far off base. Take two epidemiologic studies, there will always be inconsistencies. The reason for those inconsistencies have to do with the differences in the underlying population and also with changes that from one workforce to another in for example, the housing structure and so forth. But a lot of it has to do with sheer chance, with randomness, because we're dealing with statistics and not laboratory science. So, but in our case, we were very gratified that our principal findings tended to be replicated and rather quickly. We are also, I think, fortunate in Alberta in having working in a province that historically had relatively low smoking rates, a relatively low incidence of lung disease, which we actually demonstrated in a separate set of papers that unrelated to this work that we when we were studying asthma a few years later. So my guess is that that allowed us to see things that perhaps weren't quite as clear in other fire departments that were in other cities that didn't have this particular characteristic. But I don't think that adding an additional study, because it's really the totality of the evidence, not any individual study that matters, was the major contribution of the work that we did in Alberta. I think that the significance of what we did in Alberta, what I did and hope that it was constructive, was only to see in the scientific data evidence for what I considered to be a great injustice. And I saw an opportunity to correct that injustice and to set the record straight by looking at the data in a different way. So I think that part of why we're here today is not only that we are looking at a steadily improving database on the health of firefighters, we're also looking at a transformation in the way we look at the problem, and the way we deconstruct, take apart all of these studies and put them back together in order to get a more accurate view of what's going on. And also, I think we're holding compensation programs' feet to the fire and saying that they should do what the Act says they ought to do. And I'll expand on that in a moment. Of course, there are a lot of questions remaining. I mentioned earlier that you expect variation in epidemiologic studies. You do not expect total consistency at all times. This is particularly true when you have rare outcomes. And cancers in general, almost all the cancers we're talking about, fit a statistical definition that's called the rare disease hypothesis. And the rare disease assumption, actually it's not hypothesis, the rare disease assumption is basically a set of principles or observations about what happens when things are so rare that it's difficult to achieve enough numbers in any one study in order to demonstrate the effect that you're looking for. For one thing, the rare disease assumption makes it pretty well clear that most of your studies are going to be negative. And it is clear because the events are relatively uncommon, and so you're not going to see several of these rare cancers in one fire brigade. You're going to see a few here and a few there and so forth. And the nature of the statistical underlying relationship is that you've got to see them together in a coming out of a population large enough to have a chance of detecting the true outcome. If you can't do that, then you're kind of treading water. And there are two ways to correct for that. One is to mush them all together and basically treat it as one synthetic population. That is fraught with all kinds of hazards. It can be done, of course, and it's valuable to do that, but it's not the end-all and be-all. And another approach is to look at consistency and concordance and whether the trends are all pointing in the same direction on the part of the individual studies, and hope that you can get bigger and bigger studies that will overcome this problem, which is called lack of power. Also, there are other aspects, not just statistical uncertainty. And uncertainty, by the way, in statistics doesn't mean that we can't make up our mind. Uncertainty is a statistical property. And what it means is it's like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle in physics. You can't really be sure about this because there's random variations. And if you derive a number, a risk estimate, as we say, for the how frequent an event is compared to what you expect, there's going to be noise around that. And this noise can be statistically predicted, but sometimes the situation you're studying doesn't fit the statistical assumptions. Sometimes the noise is just too great. Sometimes the question is framed wrong. And sometimes there's bias. And these issues of bias, power, and confounding, almost every one of them, with just a couple of exceptions, certain classes of bias, but they're rare, underestimate the risk. So what I'm saying is that there's an inherent tendency in epidemiologic studies to underestimate the risks of rare diseases. And that is often overlooked. And it's kind of a dirty little secret that statisticians often don't like to admit. Well, are we splitting hairs? Are we getting into such fine points here that we're leaving reality? By examining our studies this carefully and by trying to squeeze every bit of information from the anomalies and inconsistencies? Well, I don't think so. I think that, as I'll say later in the presentation, there's a time when you need a scalpel, and that time is when you're doing your studies. You've got to get it right. And it's at that time that you've got to be a splitter rather. You've got to be precise and to know exactly what it is you're studying. And if you're not sure, you've got to kind of reserve judgment and look for corollary information. And then there are times when you need an axe. And the axe comes when you're trying to apply these principles to an individual claim. It really is not realistic to think that you're going to be able to reinvent the entire science of exposure assessment and reinvent some kind of individual-based epidemiology, which is a population science, so that's actually an oxymoron, for every single case that comes forward for a claim. And that actually is one of the best reasons for moving to a presumption instead of doing it on a case-by-case basis. The hair splitting comes with the science. When you start applying that information to the claim, you want broad categories, principles, and you want an efficient way of disposing of them fairly. And that's where the axe comes in. You don't want to be using a scalpel for every single case to try to prove the association. But we've run into a basic problem, and that's that we are really beginning to push the limits of epidemiology. What the epidemiology can do, and especially what it can do in a practical level in terms of populations that can actually be assembled. Because even 35,000 firefighters is not a huge population if you have an outcome that may appear 1 in 100,000 people annually. So you can see the problem with some of these rare diseases, that even what we would consider relatively large epidemiologic cohorts are small, considering the rare disease assumption. So one of my contributions, I hope, was to take a second look at firefighter studies and try to approach them with an open mind and looking at things fairly differently. One of them is to put more weight on to put more emphasis, I should say, on the weight of evidence rather than scientific certainty. Now, for a scientist to say that is essentially heresy, but the fact is that scientific certainty is a standard that advances our knowledge of the universe, but it doesn't do a heck of a lot in solving problems in the real world on a day-to-day basis. It's a standard of being sure that we can't achieve in daily life, and that is onerous to try to achieve when you're dealing with legitimate meritorious claims. Even people who have very clear cancers that may be associated with occupation often struggle very heavily to try to document their exposures 20 years, 30 years before. So it's an onerous burden. And of course, firefighters among the very best studied occupations. So what we're learning from work with firefighters, we can extend to other occupations, because in spite of all the uncertainties, in spite of the controversies and so on and so forth, you guys are probably the best studied occupation in the world, possibly only second to asbestos workers, for obvious reasons, because of the importance of asbestos. So the database that we have for firefighters is essentially as good as it gets. And the limitations, the controversies, the anomalies, and so forth, to me, are not standing in the way of revealed truth. To me, those anomalies and those issues are learning opportunities, ways of determining what's going on, and of changing our assumptions so that we can be fair and efficient without using a scalpel. I'm going to skip over meta-analysis because it's such a long, drawn-out discussion. But the result of all of this is that Manitoba had the passion to identify and appreciate the risk that firefighters were taking, and to introduce a fair system for compensation. I like to think that I kind of provided those two pillars, the mechanisms on which the logic could be constructed, but it was really Manitoba that kicked it off. And of course, Edmonton, without Edmonton's participation, I wouldn't even be here. So I think that we need to give full credit to the province of Manitoba for being half a century ahead of the curve in some ways. Now, I mentioned the two pillars. Just to bring that down to the ground, what do I mean by that? Well, one has to do with, gee whiz, must have been tired last night when I changed this slide, evaluating science on the balance of probabilities, as opposed to trying to get what we call a p-value, or a probability of being correct, or being incorrect rather, of 0.05, or essentially that's scientists speak for a chance of 1 in 20 of being wrong. And also to insist on returning to the intent and the meaning of the act. I casually alluded to this before. What did I mean? What I mean is that virtually every act in workers' compensation, with the exception of the state of Vermont, I have no idea why, has language in it that says that when there is an even balance of probabilities, the benefit of the doubt should be given to the worker. Essentially, they all say that, except Vermont's. However, that has been kind of lost over the years, and increasingly, certainly when I was working closely with the Workers' Compensation Board of Alberta, I was struck that cases were being adjudicated on the basis of scientific studies against a scientific level of certainty. And I don't think that that's really appropriate, because it's too high a standard of certainty that is largely unachievable in individual cases, and particularly new cases. The Act is quite clear. The Act says that when you're in doubt, you give the benefit of the doubt to the worker. And all I'm saying is go back to the original intent of the Act and respect it. And if you do, of course, then a lot of the uncertainty in the data interpretation, the scientific interpretation I'm talking to, becomes much less of an issue. Again, to repeat, scientific certainty is not reasonable. It's seldom attainable, even in ideal situations, and very hard for the individual claimant, and very wasteful, because you have to make the same case over and over and over again for all of these cases as they come up. It also is contrary to the explicit intent of the law, which we have to remember that workers' compensation comes out of tort litigation. And civil litigation says if you have a 50% chance of being correct and a feather's breadth favoring your side, then you win the case. In other words, it's the weight of evidence, balance of probabilities, a 50% standard of being correct. To then go to a 95% standard of being correct by holding it to a scientific standard of certainty is actually contrary to the original intent of the legislation. In workers' compensation, we also have this feature where the benefit of the doubt is being given to the claimant. This, by the way, is slightly different. Alex probably can tell you all about this from civil litigation, where the benefit of the doubt is usually given to the defendant. In practical terms, and I'm not going to go into the mathematics behind it, but it's actually in your notebook. A 50% probability of there being an association actually corresponds very neatly with a relative risk, which is a risk estimate, the cases you see over the cases you expect to see, of 2. So we're constantly looking for a relative risk of 2, or a doubling of risk among firefighters, as something that we can point to and say, there, see? This means that in any group of firefighters, that in any given case coming out of that group, that more likely than not, the cancer arose out of firefighting. So that's what a relative risk of 2 means. And it's pretty powerful for that reason. So we look for outcomes that begin to approach 2 as a kind of magic number. Now, obviously, there's uncertainty around that, which we have to deal with, but we'll get to that in a moment. Now, in my work, in looking at the data, my study and then other studies that had advantages over mine and so forth, I started to focus in and I began to see patterns. And to my mind, there were 4 key issues. One of them had to do with what you do with studies in which there was insufficient power. In other words, the numbers were too small to really get a clear picture. What do you do with studies in which the outcomes are coded in such a way that that doesn't make a lot of sense from the medical point of view? What do you do when the risk estimate is diluted because it's mixed in with something in which the risk is low? You can take a cup of coffee and you can recognize it as coffee. If you pour it into a pail of water, you can't recognize that it's coffee anymore. The water has diluted the coffee so that if the coffee represents risk, you're not going to see it. And confounding, which we'll get to in a moment. It's a slightly more complicated concept. So those were the 4 issues that came to mind. And I devised a set of what I called frameworks in order to take this into account. The power issue is probably the simplest. When you have insufficient power to achieve scientific certainty, statistical significance, that doesn't mean you stop there. To me, it means you go back to the studies and look at the general tendency, how strong it is, and whether the weight of evidence suggests that there's an association, regardless of the final outcome. Bladder is a great example. Kidney was a great example. And even though there are studies that are so-called negative, because probably because of power considerations, there's even if they don't achieve statistical significance, there are enough studies out there that suggest that this is real. Also, if you have groups in these various studies in which you have a better indication of exposure, for example, in one famous study in Philadelphia, the risk of bladder cancer is one thing for the overall firefighters population, and it's higher for those firefighters that have been well documented to be on the fire scene and reliably exposed, taking out the certain categories that introduced a dilution effect. So when the risk estimate starts getting higher and higher and higher, the better you have, you get a handle on the exposure to fire smoke, then that's really good evidence that you're overcoming some confounding factor and that the association is real, even if it's not at a scientific level of certainty. Testicular was easy because our colleagues in New Zealand, by the way, thank you, New Zealand, and elsewhere, did a wonderful job of documenting that this somewhat rare cancer that had been overlooked in the past is well documented now to be an occupational exposure. Why is not entirely clear. Another thing that was that's useful when you have a case like this is to triangulate with other occupational groups, looking at the effect of smoking, because smoking has some similarities to fire smoke. Pot room workers in the aluminium smelting business, because they too are exposed to PAHs, et cetera, et cetera. And when you start seeing, for example, bladder and kidney pop up, then that's a good toxicological corroborative evidence that you're dealing with an actual risk. The next two frameworks, as I call them, had to do with the fact that rare cancers are often aggregated into larger groups. Now, epidemiologists in the past did this mostly in order to achieve enough numbers in order to do their statistical calculations. But they put a lot of things together that don't belong together. And in my opinion, kind of obscured the situation. Brain cancer, for example, the one that's of great interest to us is glioma, because that's the one most likely to show a chemical induction. But if you lump in all the other causes of brain cancer, you're going to dilute the risk coming from that one particular cancer. Likewise, the myelogenous cancers, lymphomas, leukemias, that kind of thing, are sufficiently dissimilar, but from the epidemiologist's point of view, it was convenient in the past to lump them all together into one category. You can't do anything with that. It really is not helpful, except as the most crude indication that there may be something going on in that aggregate category. And in the case of the lymphomas, it was even further complicated, because Hodgkin's disease and non-Hodgkin lymphoma, which are two very different kettle of fish, were lumped together. And non-Hodgkin lymphoma, when it was separately looked at, was used until fairly recently. A pathology diagnosis was used, which is now completely not accepted and has been bypassed. So a lot of that literature really has to be looked at all over again. This framework number two was the brain cancer example, that you have one disease that is elevated, but because you've aggregated it into different diseases that have a lower risk, you don't see the strong elevated risk. And I personally think that that's what's going on with brain cancers, and one of the reasons why different studies of brain cancer skip all over the place in terms of their risk estimate is because this is not a common cancer, and there are you're dealing with the statistical variation of an uncommon cancer against the statistical variation of many cancers that really don't belong in the same category. So I think that because there's one main category of brain tumor that we're concerned about, and because it constitutes the majority of cancers of the brain, then I think we should simply accept that that this is an association worthy of presumption, because it's gliomas are going to drive the risk for the group as a whole. As we say in Washington these days, it isn't rocket surgery. You don't have to use a scalpel in order to make these distinctions. You have to recognize that they're there and have broad principles for how you're going to apply it. Framework number three is harder, and that's where the different diseases are individually rare, but the epidemiologists have put them into groups. But there's no one disease that predominates. And for that problem, which was the leukemia, lymphoma, myeloma problem, we have SMRs ranging all over the place. In your notebook, there's one particular study that I don't think you should rely on for this category of disease, but I put it in there in order to demonstrate the wild variations in risk among different categories, and the fact that leukemias, lymphomas, and myelomas don't track together at all. They do their own thing. So when you lump them together, you don't really gain much. It's an illusion of statistical stability. Also, there's a lot of misclassification because some leukemias like CLL are actually lymphomas. They just, through historically, got put in the wrong basket, and so on and so forth. So where you've got that, and this is a list of all the various lymphomas. Now, can you imagine trying to study each one individually to try to see which one is related to firefighters? I predict that this probably never will be done, and if it is done, it'll only be for follicular and a few of the most common. So in that situation, you really can't identify a specific association. You don't know where you are. You know there's an elevation. You don't know which of these particular diseases there are, and I think you have no choice but to invoke the benefit of the doubt clause and accept the association. Now, the last one is perhaps a bit more traditional problem epidemiologically, and that's what do you do when there's a confounder? And of course, the most important confounder in almost any epidemiologic study is cigarette smoking. Fortunately, a problem that's becoming less and less common in the fire service. A confounder is, a lot of people say that a confounder is a distracting exposure, something that relates to the original exposure, so there's a reason why it varies with the original exposure, and it also is a risk factor for the outcome. So it's not like it's just causing noise, it's that it's actually is its own relationship, and it's making it difficult to see the relationship you're most interested in. So what I've told my students is that a confounding factor is a risk factor that is very important, but it's not the one you're studying. It's the one that the guy next door is studying. So you have to subtract out that effect. That's not so easy. In the case of non-smoking firefighters, most studies come in at approximately 150, which means 50% elevated. If you assume that cigarette smoke is similar to fire smoke in terms of its carcinogenic potential, there's actually a mathematical approach that you can use based on certain well-documented assumptions. Now, I'm not going to march you through this. It's tedious enough. But if you do the math and back out what the risk probably is for non-smokers, you can see it's really quite high, a 3.3 as opposed to 2. Do I have confidence that that's the actual number? No, but it's a big number epidemiologically, and it's pointing in the direction that's of concern to me. So the exact number isn't so important. It's the implications of the number. Now, another way of looking at it is that what would be the lowest overall risk estimate that you see among firefighters for lung cancer that would be compatible with a doubling of risk in that percentage that represented non-smokers, which, by the way, were still the majority of firefighters, even though we made some assumptions early on that reflected smoking in an earlier era. And it turns out that we're comfortably in the range of what we actually see. So that's why I personally feel confident that the literature supports non-smokers as being at elevated risk. But there are also equity issues. I think that it's unjust to treat non-smokers as if they share the same risks as smokers. So when you have a lung cancer in a non-smoker, which happens about 10% of the frequency of lung cancer among smokers, I don't think it's fair to treat them in the same way as to marginalize their risk because they smoked, which is what compensation boards used to do. And I further think that if smoking were not an exclusion criteria at higher, that it shouldn't be held against the firefighter. That's a little more controversial. And given that there are no relevant models, we really have to use, or no relevant data, because nobody's done a study of non-smoking firefighters yet. We have to use these mathematical models because we don't have anything much better. So that is why I've concluded that the most likely estimate of the relative risk of non-smokers, the exact number is not so important, but it is clearly higher than for smokers and consistent with a doubling. Now you take all of these factors, maybe this, maybe that, using a scalpel, parsing out what the different studies said, and trying to put them back together in a way that makes sense. But there are practical problems, and one of them is that that these numbers are not accurate to the second or third decimal place. An elevation of 1.7, for example, usually could not be distinguished statistically from a doubling of risk. So to hold to a relative risk of 2 as being your standard, you can't be too dogmatic about it. If you're in the ballpark, then you should probably accept it, especially knowing that the general tendency in epidemiologic studies is probably to underestimate the risk. And of course, most individual studies lack power. The biggest studies are starting to get there, but for some of these relatively uncommon conditions, we're probably never going to have a perfectly clear answer. I personally depart a little bit from some of my epidemiologist colleagues in that I feel quite strongly that weight should be given to the positive studies, because I personally feel that when power is low and when you have a rare disease, that negative studies have basically missed not only cases, but they've missed the association. So what you're doing by lumping them together with positive studies is essentially diluting the positive studies with studies that missed it. So that's why I personally am a little hesitant to rely too heavily on study methodologies that put them all together. And I tend to give more weight to positive studies, and I look for what the anomalies show us and the distribution of around a different mode that represents an elevated cancer risk. That's epi-speak for the positive studies are telling you more than the negative studies. Now, am I out to lunch and is this all junk science? Well, believe it or not, this is a question that I asked myself many, many times over the last 20 years, because of course I wouldn't say that I was a voice howling in the wilderness. The howling might have been correct, but there weren't a lot of people that were agreeing with me, at least right at the beginning. So one of the things that I did right from the very beginning was to write these things up, these ideas up as I had them in a series of articles, and to make sure that they were peer-reviewed. Peer review is the way that scientists have of getting feedback and correcting one another so that they don't go wildly wrong. It's not a perfect system, but it helps stay on track. So I tried at every step to ensure that I wasn't way out of the bounds of reason by having everything scrupulously peer-reviewed. The last paper that I published on this with the frameworks was in a British journal. Now, why did I publish it in a British journal? Very, very specifically, I chose that for a reason, and that is that Britain does not have a workers' compensation system. So a whole dimension of biases and prejudices and second thoughts and jumping to conclusions about implications and so forth that would have been present with reviewers of an article submitted to an American journal were subtracted out by submitting the paper to a British journal. And this is one of the ways that I was trying to make sure that nobody could accuse me of bias and of overextending. Well, believe it or not, I really am winding up here. I've come away after so many years, almost 30 years of working on this problem with certain conclusions. My conclusion about the science is that these data are as good as it gets, that firefighters are so heavily studied, and that this is what we've got and it is what it is. And we need to look at it carefully because sure, we'll be getting better and bigger studies, and I hope that we learn from them. But I don't think that there's going to be a quantum leap in terms of a breakthrough, because we're operating at a level, at a power level, where it takes a massive effort to close the uncertainty for some of these rare conditions. I think it's clear that firefighters are at risk for a variety of cancer outcomes. I have no doubt of that. That not all studies of firefighters are equal. The literature continues to evolve, but we can't wait for the perfect study. The perfect study doesn't exist. And the perfect study will have statistical uncertainties. It may have some elements of bias, because it's almost impossible to create a study without bias. In fact, many people say it is impossible. Epidemiology has to follow the best science, but the interpretation of the epidemiologic findings have to be relevant to the application. And we are instructed to use more likely than not scientific certainty, in making decisions about compensation. And the decision must be made. It can't be deferred for the next study. I think that the current practices have tended to deny that and impose a huge burden on the claimants. Apportionment, which I could give you another lecture on, is a method of trying to decide what percentage contributed to an individual's outcome. It's too arbitrary, and the current experience with apportionment in California is too subjective in terms of the physician's opinion. So that's why I think the presumption is the best way forward as a strategy, and why I've supported it over the years. Another set of conclusions that have to do with adjudication. I don't think scientific certainty is fair, and it's not allowed anyway in courts and in adjudicating compensation cases. You always need to examine detailed cases carefully. You can't just say, well, the studies say this, without regard to the individual's exposures, but they have to be taken on the totality of evidence. So acceptance of claims is a matter of policy and equity. It also has uncertainty, and you're not going to get away with that, get away from that. A good adjudication starts with the science, but it doesn't end there. Science cannot answer all questions. At some point, assumptions and logic need to come into play, and that's precisely why the language of the Acts say that the benefit of doubt should be given to the worker. Because ultimately, what we're after is a system that is fair and just to those who serve, a system that's grounded in reality and science. And notice I say grounded, not necessarily a system that uncritically takes the latest study and applies it without looking at it from all points of view, that interprets cases in context, not in a vacuum, that's efficient and practical, but equity, I would say, is more important than efficiency, and that meets the needs of those of us, of you, who willingly assume the risk every day to protect us all. Because, as I say, sometimes you need a scalpel, and that's when you're doing the science, and sometimes you need an axe, and that's when you're processing the claim, and that's not the time to be making tiny little fine distinctions and dredging up obscure scientific articles. But above all, I think that what's important is to do what's right. And I think that this process, which I've been privileged to be a part of, is striving heroically to do what's right. Thank you.